We spent the first 2 weeks, and again, those are my favorite 2 weeks, but we spent the first 2 weeks talking about the world. We started with a single man. We progressed for 10 generations. We reached the point where the earth was no longer capable, as God saw it, of performing what he wanted. And so we went through a flood, a Mabul. After the flood, we again started over, not with one man, but with a man, his wife, and their 3 sons and the 3 daughter-in-laws. And some say they even had a giant that was hanging on to the outside of their ship called Og. But we move into the next period of time. And at that period of time, we watch it grow. And it doesn't take long, according to the Bible, because it's in the next chapter that we already begin to see the idea of the Tower of Babel. But I really want to stop for a second and let you understand the flood occurs in 1656 from the creation of Adam. The Tower of Babel will occur in 1996 from the year Adam was created. So we're talking about a 300-year period, 340 actually. And it makes a huge difference in what we think actually happened, because we find ourselves thinking that this is a small collective that moves to Shinar back in the days of the Tower of Babel, when in actuality, not everyone moved there. It was actually the home to Ham and his family. Those were the ones that moved there. Shem moved towards what we today call Israel. Japhet moved towards Europe. And there were some scatterings of different others going other places. But we began to focus, or God focused us on the Tower of Babel. And that's the event that we looked at. So we watched the Tower of Babel and man were scattered. And now we look again, God did not destroy man, but God picked a man. He picked Avraham. And now I want to ask a question, and it's an easy question. Why did God pick Avraham?
Is this rhetorical? Or are you asking for?
I'm asking a question. Why did God pick Avraham?
So let me pose this, and so I could be completely wrong, but I know that he said to Avram that I've chosen you because you will teach your children, your generations, my Torah. So, and because he's kept his Torah, but the whole point is, did Hashem pick Avram because he could see that these people will will pay attention and protect the Torah? It's just an idea.
Can you find your idea in the Torah?
I think I would have to go back and read the portion where it says that before I could tell you exactly where.
Okay.
Yeah.
The correct answer is no reason was given. God chooses Avram, but he gives no specifics. We have no stories to base his choice on. His choice simply was, I choose you.
That's correct. Okay, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
But there's a significance to that. You see, there was no conditions, no preconditions. In other words, I chose you because you destroyed all the idols. Because eventually down the line, his children loved idols, worshiped idols. Well, I didn't choose you because you were faithful in giving. Because down the line, we know his children weren't faithful in giving. You see, the promise that God made to Avram is really the promise he makes to us, each and every one of us. There is no reason why he chose us. He just did. Now, therefore, there's no precondition. It is a matter of us making a decision. The decision is go to yourself. because that's the question. Lech lecha, go to yourself. Think about that. Each person, whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, that choice is yours. You make that choice. You make the decision of going to. And that's what this whole story for the rest of the Torah is about, going to God. Now, the characters may change, but the concept's still the same. It's all about where we go. You know, Avraham, if we go back to the stories, and there are many, many stories, but none of them are found in the Torah itself. We know that at 3 years of age, according to some, he was outside of the cave that he had been living in because he had to live in a cave. Terah, who was an idol maker, was the chief joy of a character called Nimrod. And Nimrod was worried about losing his kingdom. So he appointed for himself, and you can't hardly imagine this story, but he appointed for himself the decision, I will not allow a person to become alive that would actually take the chance of losing my kingdom. So he hired Terah to kill all the babies. You've never heard this story before. But as he goes through this, on the same day that he knows that there was a child born that would eventually usurp his throne, which was Avraham, he sends Avraham out again. But his sorcerers tell him, oh, the problem is it's in Terah's house. His wife just gave birth to a boy. Now, Terah was 70 years old, which doesn't sound bad because I'm 74, but he was 70 years old when he had his first child, which is reasonable considering how many he lived, 210 years. But the problem was the fact that he was so far after what had been typically going on in that period of time when people were birthing at 30 and 35. He's at 70 and still hadn't had his first child. Well, the child was born, and his mentor, Nimrod, wanted him to destroy his child. And so he wasn't ready to do that. So he hid his son in a cave. And luckily, as he's going back to explain what's going on to Nimrod, he finds out that his servant's wife had just produced a baby boy. And so he slaughtered that baby boy, pretending it was his. Well, obviously, Avraham then continued to live, but he lived out of a cave for the first 3 years, had never seen daylight, had never seen darkness. He just saw the inside of the cave. Well, the story goes on that he walks out of the cave and the first thing he sees is the sun, and he looks at the sun and he begins to worship the sun. He wants him to stand still and he wants to talk to him, but the sun doesn't stand still. It just continues on. Well, then the moon comes up. Well, then you must be the creator. And so he begins to look at the moon. He begins to talk to the moon. The moon goes through the sky and it's gone. Well, then it's just darkness and stars. So he begins to say, there's got to be, well, here's a bright star. I think I'll talk to it, but nothing happens. He all of a sudden begins to understand God isn't a sun. God isn't a moon. God isn't a star. God isn't a tree. God is God. And he begins to worship him. And that becomes his focus at 3 years of age. Now, as he grows older, he ends up finding a day when he works in the shop for his dad, because his dad was out delivering orders, so he was standing guard. Remember the story, I think you know the story, when he delivers the things, Abraham destroys all the images that are in the shop, except for one, the littlest guy over in the corner, and he puts an axe next to the little guy. And so Terah comes back and look, what happened? He says, well, they had a fight. Who had a fight? Well, the idols did. And the little one over in the corner, he won. Wait a second. How can anything made with my hands ever be alive? And he said, exactly. Why do we worship something that was never alive? Well, Terah, in his anger, goes to see Nimrod. And he says, I have to tell you, I can't complete my orders because my son destroyed all of my idols in my shop. And so I can't provide you with what you need. And he says, why did he do that? He says, well, my son's different than most kids. He doesn't believe in idols and multiple gods. He believes in one God. To which Nimrod says, bring your son to me. So Nimrod brings his son, or Terah brings his son to him. And in the course of the time, what happens is the fact he says, what do you believe? And Avraham says, I believe in the one true God. To which he says, do you really believe that? How strongly do you believe that? Are you willing to go into a furnace believing that? And you know, Avraham said yes, but I want you to understand more than that. It was his faith that pulled him through. I know in the New Testament it says faith is a substance hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. That's not true faith. True faith is to believe in God, and whatever happens is in God's hands, and it's for God's purpose, and it's all good. That's faith. So Abraham is thrown into the furnace, 7 times hotter than it's supposed to be. In fact, it kills the guys that are going to toss him in. We know the story. He runs around, and lo and behold, there's this other image in there with him. And finally, both images come out. And at that point in time, Avraham survived. Nimrod's upset. He looks at Terah and he says, who do you believe? And Terah says, I believe in you. And he says, look at your son. He didn't. What about your other son? You see, he had another son with him, Haran. He had 3 sons. He had his oldest, Avraham, and he had his youngest, Haran. Nahor wasn't there at all. In fact, Hor didn't live in Shinar. Hor lived at Haran, according to the book of Joshua. I think it's the 24th chapter. That's where he lived. And actually, Terah grew up in Haran. But we'll go back to the story. So anyway, Haran was asked the question, who do you believe? Well, he just watched Avraham walk through the fires. I'm going to go with the guy who has the winning record. I'm going to go with Avraham. Well, they tossed him in and Haran died. You see, his faith wasn't in God. His faith was in Avraham. He must have had the right answers. He must have known the side of that's coolest in the furnace. And he dies. Well, at that point in time, we find that Terah and his son and his 2 daughters and nephew, let's see, try it again. Terah, his wife, and again, Avraham, and Sariah and Milcah and Lot leave Ur of the Chaldees. Oh, by the way, Ur is a very fascinating word. Ur is a place. It's at the tip of the Euphrates and Tigris River. That's where it's at. It's not far from Shinar or from where Babel was, but it is a distance. And they left there. Ur. Ur also means furnace. It's our only hint in the scriptures about Abraham's experience in the fiery furnace. Now they go from there 600 miles to Haran, which would be northern Syria. That's where they're going to. Haran means a dry place. And so Avraham takes his family. He doesn't have a family. You see, he's still not married yet. His whole group goes up with Terah to Haran, where his brother Nahor is. He will marry Sariah, which technically was his niece, and Nahor will marry Milcah, who is also a niece. But anyway, while they're there, we have this story again about God speaking to Avraham and saying, go to yourself, go from here. Now, he doesn't tell him where to go. Just like when we go through this process of our lives, where are we going? What are we doing? How are we getting there? All those are still in God's hands. We have an idea of what we want, but really God is really in control if we are honest with ourselves. And so we begin the process of going. Now, there's lots of things that are happening here. One of the things I want to talk about is briefly is the word Abraham is called the first one to be called a Hebrew. Now, the question then becomes, why is he called a Hebrew? And actually, the word that's used is an Ivrit. Now, an Ivrit can mean other side, or it can also mean the idea of pertaining to something on the other side. So Abraham might have been from the other side. And then the question is, the other side of the tracks? No, it's the other side of the river. Well, there were three opinions. Rabbi Yehuda taught that the word ever means opposite side. Abraham believed in one God and the rest of the world worshiped the man-made gods, but Abraham stood on one side and the entire world was on the other. Now, the second reason, their second idea came from Rabbi Nehemiah, who preached that it's the reference to Ivar, and Ivar was actually Eber in our modern Bibles, and Eber was the son of Shem. And so when he's called an Eber, he's referring to his lineage coming through Eber. Now, there's other rabbis that came to the conclusion that this is about the fact that he was an Ivrit because of the fact that it speaks of his ancient origins. Now, he's the first one called Eber. Do you know who the second one was? Joseph. Joseph came from the other side. The other side of what? What did Joseph seek to do? Well, first off, once he reached a position of serving, he found himself circumcising everyone, trying to bring them to the other side. So the other side really speaks of a spiritual change, the idea of going someplace else. So we now have a story of Abraham wandering. He'll wander 600 miles, and the first place he'll stop after he arrives there is Shechem. Shechem becomes an important site because Shechem is one of those places which we read about where Jacob had his son or his daughter actually raped. We continue on, and he finds himself wandering through, well, it's not Israel then. In fact, it's not called anything, but it becomes Canaan. And that's important that it became Canaan, that it wasn't originally that. Because what do you hear when you look at the Palestinian question? Who's been there all along? The Canaanites, not the Jews, the Canaanites. There's a whole book written just debunking the whole idea. But anyway, I can't stop. I've already gone too far. So let me continue on. A drought comes to the land. Abraham does what? He and his family move south. They go to Egypt. And he now experiences Egypt just as his kids will experience Egypt for 210 years. Worried for his life, finding himself away from his wife. Plagues happen. Finally, he leaves with his wife and all the riches that he could possibly want, just as Israel will leave Egypt with all their riches. But it's not done there, because he finds himself coming back, and he moves to back into the land, and he and his nephew are now having problems because they both have too much. Avraham doesn't want to contend with his nephew, so he says, here, you choose which place you want. And we know what he chose. He chose the well-watered valley. So Avraham moves up onto the hillside and actually moves to where we call the plain of Mamre, which is near what then was called Kiryat Arba, the city of four. Well, it eventually meant the city of four graves. The grave for Adam and Eve, the grave for Abraham and Sarah, the grave that would be there for Isaac and Rebekah, and then finally the grave that was there for Jacob and Leah. Now today it's called Hebron. In fact, in the scriptures, it listed as Hebron, but it really wasn't Hebron until much later in time. But sometimes as they're writing this, and again, it's Moses who's actually doing the transcribing of what God said, he updates it. He brings it into the century in which Moses lived, as opposed to keeping it in Kiryat Arba. But anyway, that's beside the story. So now we have them again moving through time. But I want to focus tonight, after 3 pages of introduction, I want to focus tonight on chapter 14, because I want to talk about the first battle that was ever recorded in scriptures. And that's the battle of 4 kings versus 5 kings. And that's chapter 14, and it begins in first verse. So I want you to turn there if you would. And I want to go through this text and try to give you some understandings. Now, some of what I gathered from this material, and you probably have seen it, but you didn't know about it, and I'm going to show it to you. This is my book. It's called The Living Torah. It's written by Ari Kaplan. Now, the Bible's the Bible, but again, just like the Living Bible, its language is a little bit different. It's trying to update the language so that those reading it can understand. But what makes the book so exciting, to me anyway, is the amount of footnoting that goes into these scriptures. And that helped me just to kind of reinforce what I was thinking as I go through the Torah. But let's go to the story. So it happened in the days of the kings. The first king's name is Amraphel, king of Shinar. Arioch, king of Elisar. Helamander, the king of Elam, and Tidal, which was the king of Oim. And these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shemad, king of Admah, Shember, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which was Zoar. So all of these had joined at the valley of Siddim, now in the Salt Sea. And the 12 years they had served Shalmander, and they rebelled in 13 years. So now it's the 14th year. So let's stop for a second. Shalmander is the actual leader of this. They list it as Amraphel, but we're going to find out why his name was first and not the actual leader that started this. You see, his empire, the empire that belonged to Shamuel, the Elamite Empire, was actually the strongest empire of the 4 kings. He had conquered all of the lands that are there. He led what was now a united world, so to speak. Everybody fell under his control. Well, these 5 kings decided that they couldn't afford to pay his tribute anymore, and they rebelled. And so for 13 years, they did not pay their tribute. Well, Shalmander finally had decided enough is enough. And so he brought his army, plus the other 3, from what we would call the Mesopotamian area, and actually all the way across. It was the whole Mesopotamian valley, all the way from the Mediterranean, all the way down through the 2 rivers, down to the bottom. And he brought all of those empires together with him, a massive force. And he left the north, and he came down, and if you have a sanctified imagination, imagine they came on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, down through the country called Jordan, all the way down below the Dead Sea, and around at what we would call the Arava, and began to move north. Now, during that time, they defeated again and collected more ransom from all of the nations that they passed through. Now they had arrived at the valley with the 5 kings. And again, as you see the story, the 5 kings, that valley was actually part of the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea, for the longest period of time. The Dead Sea will not grow into that area because it's very, very shallow until later in time. But at this point in time, that salt sea is not there. But what is there will be tar pits. The tar pits, or the asphalt, was necessary in the construction of their buildings. It was the cement that they used back in those days. And so in the course of time, as this is all going on, the five kings decided, our armies are large, but they're not as large as theirs. Let's compete with them down in the valley. So we have the water on one side and mountains on the other side. So there's a limited number of enemy that can attack us at one time. What they didn't count on was the fact that those four enemies were so concentrated that they literally destroyed the five, and they all began to scatter. Well, the place they could scatter to was the tar pits. And the tar pits were not always easily visible, just like quicksand was not easily visible. And so the kings themselves stumbled into the tar pits. The only king that's going to survive out of this will be the king of Sodom. All the rest of the kings will die, but not the four kings. They'll survive this whole thing. They'll gather together all of the wealth of those five cities, and they'll also take prisoners to be slaves. Among the prisoners will be Lot, and they will head north. Now, totally unaware of what was going on was our character called Avraham. One of the what's called a refugee escaped the battle and ran to where Avraham was to tell him that Lot had been captured and they were taking him. By the time the messenger arrived, who according to the Midrash was Og, the giant, 10 foot tall, he arrived. He told him, Abraham gathered together his students or his servants or whatever you want to call them, believers in him. And he was going to chase after the army of the four kings. Well, in chasing after the army of the four things, the one thing that comes to his mind is the fact that not all of them wanted to go. And so Avraham, before leaving, says, if you are afraid, you do not have to go. If you're just married, you do not have to go. So two of the three reasons by which an Israeli soldier doesn't have to go to war were expressed back then. You see, the 318 didn't have a land portion that belonged to them. So those that suggested they would go gathered with Avraham, and they moved towards the four armies. Now remember, the four armies are huge, and he has only a small force. But what's interesting is the fact that there was one thing on his side in the battle. As he approached the enemy armies, he grabbed the soil, the dust off the ground, and he mixed with straw, he threw it at the enemy. The straw turned into arrows and spears and began to kill the enemy. Well, the enemy fired arrows and threw spears at Avraham, but as they did, they all turned to dust. And Avraham picked it up again and threw it back at them, according to the Midrashic writings. Now, the four kings had a 10-day head start. Lo and behold, Avraham leaves at midnight, and he catches them in the morning. They had a 10-day head start. Well, wait a second. That's kind of like the story of Eliezer going up to see, what's going on. The idea is now that there's miracles after miracles happening. And as this process goes on, kings are able to scatter. Abraham splits his troop, his 318, into two groups, and they continue the fight all the way up to Damascus, Syria. Damascus is the oldest city known. At that point in time, they recapture all the wealth that had been taken. They recaptured all the people, and they bring Lot and all of the rest of them back. And that's when we find them at the area called Salem or Shalom. which is the area where Shem, now known as Melchizedek, lives. And at that particular point in time, we watch the gifting that goes back and forth. Well, as we watch the gifting going back and forth, we have to understand, amongst those that were killed by Avraham were Shem's grandsons. But Shem honors Avraham for doing God's will and provides him with offerings. And in turn, Avraham provides tithe. Not the tithe of what Sodom had or Gomorrah or any of those others. It's the tithe from the merchandise they received from all of the other kings that they had captured their wealth on the way down. Now, the story is interesting, but what's even more interesting is those four kings and their names. You see, those four kings represent something. What do they represent? Well, the first one listed there was Amraphel. Amraphel, king of Shinar, is actually said to be Nimrod. Amraphel was his early name. He chose the name Nimrod. So Shinar is there. But we would better know it today as Babylon. Now, the second character that's listed there is Erok, king of Elasar. Well, Elasar happens to be the place where Alexander the Great was confirmed king. Elasar is Greece. Chelamanter is from Elam. Elam is the city in Persia where Darius the Mede had come from, where we began to see the kingdom of Ahasuerus. It was the Medes and Persians area. The last one's name was, as you look at it again, the last one was called Tidal. But notice the name of his people, Goyim, the Goy. Who are the Goy? Well, according to the story, they're the hordes. In other words, they have no one particular nation. When we look at the future, they will be called Rome. So the four kings that he fights with, remember, he's just come back from Egypt, where they will spend 210 years in captivity. They will find themselves for 70 years in captivity in Babylon. They will find themselves in captivity in Media Persia. They will find themselves overrun by the Greeks, and finally by the Romans. God has given us an early picture in this first battle because it wasn't the very first battle ever fought in history, but it's the first battle in which we can find a reference back to the kingdoms that are going to be found in the book of Daniel. So our story goes back to the fact that lots of things will happen in the future of Israel. And Avraham has been exposed to all of it. God is great.